Hello, I'm Mark Dury, and this is the second lecture on Israel. I'm speaking about challenges that Israel faces, and my main focus will be particularly on the ideological challenge, the challenge of Islam in the context in which Israel finds itself today. But before I launch into a discussion of that, I'd like to point out that Israel is a country like any other country. It has strengths and weaknesses. It can be rightly criticized and rightly praised. It does good, it does bad. It has the normal kind of range of politics. You have left wing and right wing politics. And even though it's like other countries in this respect, it is unique in its environment. It's the only stable democracy in the Middle East. By a whole range of measures of freedom, it's freer than any Islamic nation. So there's 60 or so Islamic nations in the world today. None of them have the levels of freedom that the people of the citizens of Israel enjoy. It also has a strong economy. It's been growing stronger and stronger. It's lifted by technical innovation. David Goldman has said that many things make Israel prone to innovation. Israel is a hothouse for startups. Now, in a nation, innovation drives wealth, and that's been a big part of America's wealth, although innovation in the US is declining now, and it's rising in China, which is a worry for the Americans, I think. But Israel has been listed on a Bloomberg list as number 6 for innovation in the world, and it's in the company of countries like Germany, South Korea, Singapore, Sweden, and Switzerland. So it's an innovator, it's a generator of wealth. It also has some other advantages. It has vast natural gas reserves, which have been discovered in the last few decades, only beginning to be exploited. And its difficult in climate and difficult in environment has caused it to innovate in areas that are very exportable, such as water technology, agricultural technology, and it's also a leader in digital technology as well. It also has a stable demography. And this is not always understood. 50 years ago, the birth rates of Israeli Arabs were much higher than Jews, but today they've evened out. So at present, it's about three quarters, 75% Jews in Israel, 21% Arabs, and the population is growing steadily at around 2%. The fertility rates of Israeli women is 3 births per woman on average. And what's really remarkable is that this has been stable for around 40 years, and it is by a significant margin the highest in the OECD nations. Here is a plot of what's been happening to fertility of nations in the last 50 years. And you can see that since about 1980, Israel's fertility has remained level. So that's the level coloured line. I'm actually red-green colorblind, so I'm not sure if it's red or it's green, but there it is. Contrast that with Saudi Arabia's fertility rate, which has gone from just over 7 children per woman down to just a bit over 2, a huge change in that period. And you'll see many other nations it's normal that fertility's been dropping. As economies advance, fertilities drop, but not in Israel. Israel's been powering ahead economically and socially in many ways, but its fertility has stayed around 3 children per woman over the last 40 years, gone up and down, sometimes a bit above it, sometimes a bit below it. Now you may say, well, where is that fertility coming from? Well, today, fertility for Jews and Arabs is at parity, so they're both around 3, but the long-term trend is rising for Jews and falling for Arabs. So the trend has been that Jewish fertility has been increasing and Arab fertility has been dropping. And so what with this and immigration, the long-term outlook is that the Jewish majority in Israel is slowly increasing, and that trend will keep going, be going for decades, one would expect. So that's already really quite remarkable that Israel is a modern democratic nation enjoying freedoms that would be the envy of the Arab world, or should be, but also has a strong population growth. I want to focus, having noted some strengths that Israel has, I want to focus on 6 challenges that it faces, all in one way or another to do or connected with Islam. The first issue is going to be Islamic anti-Semitism, and then resurgent European anti-Semitism, the false histories, Islamic exceptionalism, victimhood theology of Islam, and also the importance, the significance of the major crisis that's been happening in the Islamic world. Now, for better or for worse, Israel, a country of 10 million people, is stuck right in the heart of the Arab Islamic world. And so the ideological environment in which it finds itself is very important for its security, and I'm going to be unpacking that with you. Firstly, Islamic anti-Semitism. Israel, surrounded by Islamic states, was established during a period of a global Islamic awakening. Islam's been rising, it's been trying to restore itself to glory, and Israel was established during this period. Now, it just so happens that animosity to the Jews is actually hardwired into Islam. It's there in the primary core texts of the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad. And this has grassroots implications for Muslims. It impacts the way in which Muslims think about the Jews and the way they think about Israel all over the world. And I could just relate two little separate but connected incidents to explain that or illustrate that. One was in 2003, Amrozi, the Balinese bomber that was responsible for the deaths of many, mainly Westerners in a nightclub in Bali. When he was sentenced in a courtroom, he cried out, Jews, remember Khaybar, the armies of Muhammad are coming back for you. What was really remarkable about this was that as an Indonesian Muslim, he'd probably never met a Jew in his life. He'd had no personal contact with Jews at all. And he only had that one moment when the world was listening at that very point in time. And he chose to, in a sense, curse the Jews and threaten the Jews in the courtroom in that context. And that was really remarkable. It was also very interesting that he mentioned Khaybar. We'll come to that a little bit. I'll explain what that means. And what's interesting is in 2010, there was a flotilla of boats going down to Gaza from Turkey that were going to support the Palestinians. And they were quite a number of jihadis there on those boats. And there was a video showing a group of them chanting about Khaybar. Khaybar, Khaybar, O Jews. The army of Muhammad is coming back for you. It's actually the same sentiment that Amrozi shouted out in the Balinese courtroom, but thousands of miles separated and years apart. What would it be about Khaybar and about the Jews that would cause these people to be speaking in this way? Well, as it happens, Khaybar was an oasis in Arabia, which Muhammad conquered and defeated, and it was largely inhabited by Jews. I'll explain more the significance of that in a few moments. Actually, when Muhammad began preaching in his message of Islam in Mecca, he seems to have had hopes that the Jews would accept his message, because there's some sort of half-positive things about Jews in the Quran. And he was expecting that his message was in a line of continuity with the message of Moses, and that the Jews would recognize that. When he fled to Medina and established an Islamic state there, he entered into a covenant with the local Jews and began to talk with them. And he was expecting, I think, that they'd follow him and recognize him, but they didn't. The rabbis, it says in his biography, in Muhammad's biography, it says that the rabbis used to annoy the messenger with questions. They were called the ones who ask questions. I think rabbis are probably still a bit like that these days. They know how to ask questions. Anyway, there are actually many reports in the Quran and in Muhammad's biography of his encounters with the Jews in Medina and the interactions he had, and often their challenges would be reported and his answers as well. Anyway, over time, Muhammad's rhetoric towards the Jews turns toxic, and he begins to expel the Jewish tribes from Medina. And the final tribe, the Qurayza tribe, he beheads all the men. They actually surrender to him, expecting they'll be expelled, and he beheads all the men and enslaves the women and children. And then later, he attacks the oasis of Khaybar, where a number of those tribes had gone, actually, and he kills many of them, he enslaves some, and he extracts tribute from those who remain, 50% of their harvests. And this pact of surrender is considered to be the template or the foundation in Islamic law for what became the system of subjugation applied to all Jews and Christians who lived under Islam in the centuries to come. It's a foundational event where Muhammad permitted Christian Jews, in this case, to keep their faith, but to live as tributaries under the power and the dominance of Islam. And so basically what those Turks on the boat in the flotilla and also Amrosi was saying, Jews, you will come under the thumb of Islam. We will rule over you and you will be defeated by violence, by armies. And along the way, while this is unfolding in Muhammad's life, the Quran ends up incorporating a lot of very negative comments about the Jews. I think the Jews are the most rejected and despised religious community in the Quran. A close second might be the rejectors, the hypocrites who'd sort of turned their backs on Islam after accepting it. But the Jews, the most consistently rejected and denigrated, despised religious group. So the Quran says the Jews are deceivers, they falsified their scriptures, they've been cursed by God for unbelief, they were cursed by David and by Jesus already, that some of them were turned into apes and pigs, and that's become a kind of a label for Jews. There was a time in Andalusia in Spain where Jews had to have an image of an ape on their door to show that they were Jews. It says that they love this life and don't care about the next, and that's often quoted by Palestinian jihadis. We will defeat the Jews because they're not willing to die for what they believe in, whereas we are. They are cowardly. They're just connected to the things of this life. They're treacherous. They're the greatest enemies of Islam. They will never love Muslims unless the Muslims become Jews. They start wars and cause trouble. They stir up rebellion. They're dangerous. They claim they killed Jesus. What a terrible boast. And they're losers. So that's what the Quran says about the Jews. And this has a grassroots effect on Muslims all over the world, I believe. There's also the traditions of Muhammad, which, if anything, are even more anti-Jewish. These are sayings that Muhammad is recorded as having passed on, were remembered and passed on by others, the hadiths as they're called. So Muhammad, after he expelled the tribes of Medina, he said to his followers, kill any Jew who comes into your power. This is before the genocide of the Qurayza. And we read, in fact, that some of his followers did begin to go and assassinate Jews that they encountered, particularly ones that were criticizing Muhammad. And then there's a tradition of Muhammad that says the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees, and the stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, slave of Allah," sort of a type for Muslims, "there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." And this prophecy is actually incorporated into the Hamas constitution. I believe that's what Hamas expects or hopes will happen to the Jews of Israel. They'll be killed. And even creation itself will reject the Jews so intensely that the stones and trees will cry out, begging for Muslims to come and kill the Jews. Also, so that's a tradition of Muhammad, the hadith. And also, two of Muhammad's wives actually were Jewish women that he took as war booty after their husbands had been killed. In one case, one woman was taken to Muhammad past the beheaded and tortured body of her husband, and then he married her. And then another woman he'd killed, her husband had been killed, and she was part of the war booty, and he took her, and it's reported that she refused to marry him. She was not so traumatized that she was unable to say no. She did say no to marry him, so she became his sex slave, his concubine. And later, in fact, the Islamic tradition said she did become his wife. So there's also a long tradition of Muslim scholars promoting racist anti-Semitic stereotypes. There have been repeated massacres of Jews. For example, the Jews of Granada were massacred in 1066, and the Jews of Hebron, there was a massacre in 1929. Andrew Bostom's book, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, is a great anti-Semitism, is a great resource, I think, to get a window on that history. Also, rejection of the Jews is built into daily devotion in Islam. Al-Fatiha means the opening, is the first surah or chapter in the Quran. It's quite short, and at the heart of it is this prayer for guidance. But the prayer for guidance is not only that the Muslim will be rightly guided, but also that they won't be like those on whom Allah's anger falls, and those who go astray. So this Al-Fatiha prayer is recited 17 times by Muslims when they say the 5 times daily prayers. And Muhammad explained that those on whom the anger falls are the Jews, and those who go astray are the Christians. So every pious Muslim, a Sunni Muslim, prays 17 times a day that they won't be like the Jews on whom the anger of God has fallen, or is falling, which is extraordinary, really. It's like a curse in a sense, like, Lord, may I not be like the Jews who are under your wrath. And repeating that 17 times a day for a lifetime would mean hundreds of thousands of repetitions multiplied by 1 billion people. I mean, it's extraordinary outpouring of piety, anti-Jewish piety. This text, Al-Fatiha, really has a status in Islam similar to the Lord's Prayer in Christianity. It's the one part of the Quran that almost all Muslims would memorize. It's deeply embedded in spirituality and faith, and it's a reflection of Islam's hardwired antipathy to the Jews. Now, Islamic anti-Semitism is a grassroots phenomenon. It emerges wherever Islam is entrenched, wherever people teach the Quran. I'm not saying all Muslims are anti-Semitic, far from it, but it is in the religion, and so it naturally bubbles up to the surface. And what's happened in Europe is that the very significant Islamic minorities in Europe have brought their anti-Semitism with them. And so you have anti-Semitism working amongst the immigrants in Europe. And the Islamic anti-Semitism, it must be emphasized, is not an import from Europe. It wasn't borrowed from the Christians. It may have been influenced in its origins by Christian anti-Semitism, but it's quite authentically Islamic. It's part of the birth pangs of the religion of Islam. And it's been reiterated, re-emphasized down the centuries. It's embedded in Islamic piety and hard to overcome. It's embedded actually in all the rhetoric around Israel on the Islamic side, and it's a grassroots trend. It's very interesting to read the accounts of travelers in the Islamic world before the modern times. Julia Pardo published in 1836 an account of Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire in general, and she said that I never saw the curse pronounced against the children of Israel more fully brought to bear than in the East, where they are considered rather as a link between animals and human beings than as men possessed of the same attributes as their fellow mortals. So she was shocked at how abused the Jews were on the streets of Istanbul. And for example, she saw a group of Jewish women, and then a young Turkish guy just came up and bashed one of the women, and she was thrown to the ground, and no one was able to do anything. You could bash a Jew with impunity. And she gave other accounts as well of incidents that she'd observed in very entrenched, very high level of animosity and hatred of the Jews that was part of Ottoman society and built into the experience of Jews living under Ottoman rule. Now, at the same time, across Europe, Islamic groups have brought their anti-Semitism with them, and the Muslim diaspora in Europe has been linked to rising anti-Semitic aggression, and some absolutely horrific incidents involving torture and murder, but also other things like defacing of Jewish cemeteries and attacks on synagogues. And there have been some surveys that have pointed to higher than normal rates of anti-Semitism amongst European Muslims. Now, this is a taboo subject. European elites have been slow to acknowledge the trend and in denial. Muslims are generally positioned by multicultural ideologies in the West as an oppressed minority. The first European intelligence report on Muslim anti-Semitism was in 2020 in Germany. So this is a denied subject. It's something that people don't want to talk about. Because Muslims are thought of as an oppressed minority, it's not convenient or consistent with the ruling ideology to speak of them as oppressors or as sources of hatred. But I think that this Islamic anti-Semitism is actually a contributor to the evolving mainstream climate of anti-Semitism, that this source of hatred of the Jews is partnering with latent European anti-Semitism. There's also the phenomenon of the Stockholm Syndrome, the fear of jihad. There's this classic language describing the reaction of a frightened animal when it experienced a threat. One possibility is that it could fight. Another possibility is flight, to run away. But there's a third possibility, which is not always mentioned, but is also very real. That is, it could stay and tend and befriend the enemy. So it would go up and lick the feet of its aggressor to show its submission. And that's one of the potential responses to the threat of jihad in Europe is the Stockholm Syndrome. That is, to befriend Islam, to love Muslims, to go out of your way, to honour them and to respect them. And part of that can be to buy into their hatreds, to legitimise their antipathy towards Israel and towards the Jews. And this is contributing to the anti-Semitic climate in Europe. Jews are now leaving Europe, and particularly Belgium and France, where the situation is worse for them. So, trending European anti-Semitism is undoubtedly impacting on Israel's global security. It affects its position in international relations. I have been preaching or speaking about rising anti-Semitism in Europe for more than 20 years, and it's a major issue, and I think a huge driver has been the Islamic diaspora, the Muslim diaspora in Europe. Another issue that needs to be considered is the contribution of disputes about history. It's a common view held by Arabs that the Palestinians were there in Canaan before the Jews, that they were the Arabs were the original inhabitants of Israel. They were the Philistines, they were the Canaanites, they were all Arabs, And this is allied with the Quranic claim that the biblical figures like David and Solomon and Saul, these were all Muslims as well. So if ever Solomon built a temple, it was a mosque, basically. And so this sort of fantastic history, which I'll come back to in my next lecture, is a contributor to the challenge that Israel faces to have a truthful view of history affirmed. There's also a dhimmi fantasy, which I'll also address in the next lecture as well. This is a belief in a mythological past in which Jews lived peacefully, flourishing under Muslim rule. Max Fisher, who's an American journalist, he wrote, "In fact, those two religions, Jews and Muslims, these two religious groups have been coexisting in the region for the most part peacefully since Islam was first born in the 7th century." So this is the myth of the Islamic utopia that's part of the historical negationism that Israel has to counter. Israel's legitimacy is tied to how people view history, and lies that are told about history are a significant challenge to the nation. There's also, in relation to this, the whole issue of the Nakba, the disaster that hit Palestinian society at the time of the creation of Israel. Zionism as a movement founded in the 19th century, Theodor Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 by the British government made a commitment to establish or to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was divided amongst the European powers, and the Mandate of Palestine, which included Palestine and Transjordan, was put under the supervision of the British. And then the Balfour Declaration was adopted by the League of Nations in 1922 to establish a Jewish state, or a homeland at least. The British officials, however, in Palestine were often opposed to Zionism, and they were often pro-Arab, and they facilitated Arab aggression to the Jewish immigrants and settlers. So the Jewish policy was sort of mixed. The official position was to support the founding of Israel, but on the ground it didn't always work out that way. And that was partly in the context of Britain's overall Islam and Arab policy. In India they ruled a vast number of Muslims, and they had to manage the caliphate question, they had to manage their Muslim citizens of the empire, and this influenced, I think, the way in which British administrators in Palestine interacted with Jewish immigration. Anyway, in 1928, the Mandate of Palestine was divided into Palestine and Transjordan, which became Jordan. And Transjordan was for Arabs only. Jews were prohibited from, I think, owning land or becoming citizens of that new entity. On the ground, the British weren't all that thrilled about Jewish immigration. They impeded it, even through World War II, even turning back people who were fleeing the Holocaust. In 1947, the UN resolved to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. However, there was intense opposition to this from the Arabs. The Palestinian Mufti, Amin Husseini, had been a collaborator with Hitler during World War II. He'd been leading Palestinian attacks on Jews. He was actually convicted by the British authorities to 10 years prison for that. But then a year or two later, they appointed him as the Mufti. And he had asked Hitler really to apply the final solution to the Jews in Palestine. And after the war, before and after the war, he led Arab resistance to the creation, to Jewish independence. And his goal clearly was the annihilation of the Jews. So after the UN declaration, Israel declares its independence, and it's immediately attacked by the armies of the surrounding states. Azam Pasha, the Arab League Secretary General, declared in October 1947, "I personally wish that the Jews do not drive us to this war, as this will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades." Notice that it's the Jews that are driving them to war. The Palestinian Arabs, or the Arabs, are completely unable to live in peace with the Jews. It's the Jews' fault, and if they being at fault force us to go to war, we're basically going to kill them all. We're going to massacre them. And this sort of sentiment, which was also Husseini's strategy as well, and he reflected it in his statements over some years. This was the context in which the Jews were fighting in 1948. They were fighting against the possibility of being massacred. Now, the result of this war in 1948 was an absolute disaster for the Palestinians. A very large number fled their homes. The numbers vary, perhaps 500,000 evacuated, and they fled into neighboring Arab countries. There are disputes over why they fled. One account is that some Arab authorities, or the Arab authorities, said, "Leave, get out of the way, so we can come in and mop up the Jews." And also there are reports of Jewish militias evacuating Palestinians and driving them out as well. So this is a hugely disputed issue. Why did they leave? But ultimately, what's really clear, and here is a statement from Musa Alami, one of the Arab leaders soon after the war, is that when they did leave, they expected that they would be back soon. If ultimately, he said, the Palestinians evacuated their country, it was not out of cowardice, but because they'd lost all confidence in the existing system of defence. They were told that the Arab armies were coming, that the matter would be settled, and everything returned to normal, and they placed their confidence and their hopes in that. So it's important to understand this is from the Arab side, according to their own leaders, a genocidal war, seeking to wipe the Jews off the face of Palestine. And on the other side, the Palestinians who became refugees expected to be coming back soon when the war was finished. So this was an absolute disaster. It's the great tragedy of the Palestinians. Ephraim Karsh, an Israeli historian, a Jewish historian, he said this about the betrayal of the Palestinians. He calls it a betrayal, by the way, because he believes the Arabs betrayed them. The Arabs, instead of encouraging the Palestinians in general, the Arab leaders particularly, including the Palestinian leaders, instead of encouraging the Palestinians to get on with the Jews and find a way of living together in harmony, opted for the genocide option, opted for a total war of annihilation and destruction of the Jewish presence. And the outcome of that was dispossession of not the Jews, but of the Palestinians. And that was the disaster. So Ephraim Karsh says they were betrayed, not by the Israelis, but by their own co-religionists and by the Arab states. So he said, the recent declassification of millions of documents paint a much more definitive picture that is completely at odds with the anti-Israel caricature that is so often the order of the day. They reveal that there was nothing inevitable about the Palestinian-Jewish confrontation, let alone the Arab-Israeli conflict, that the claim of dispossession is not only baseless, but the inverse of the truth, and that far from being the hapless victims of a predatory Zionist assault, it was Palestinian Arab leaders who, from the early 1920s onward, and very much against the wishes of their own constituents, launched a relentless campaign to obliterate the Jewish national revival, which culminated in the violent attempt to abort the UN partition resolution. They chose to reject this solution and to wage a war of annihilation. Their constituents, that is, ordinary Palestinians, paid the ultimate price for this folly: homelessness and statelessness. So we're speaking about the challenge of disputed histories, and this particular history is very contentious, and each side has a different understanding of what happened. The aftermath of this was that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were kept permanently as refugees, waiting for the right of return, basically. And I believe they were used by the Arab states as a sort of weapon against Israel. What a comparison with what happened to German refugees after World War II. I did a degree in Germanic languages, Germanic studies, and I'm very aware that a lot of Eastern Europe had been settled by Germans in the Middle Ages. There were huge numbers of Germans scattered across Eastern Europe. And, that was one of Hitler's arguments for conquering those regions, to liberate these Germans. But after World War II, when the Nazis were defeated, basically those Germans throughout Eastern Europe were driven out, and they fled. They fled into Germany, and there were millions of refugees. What happened to those refugees? What did people do with them? Well, the Germans could have said, "Oh, well, let's go for the right of return." After all, they'd been there for 1,000 years, some of them, or for many centuries, and their ancestors had been there for centuries. So let's put them in refugee camps on the eastern borders of Germany, and we'll tell them they have a right to return, and we'll wait until we can find the time to send them all back and the opportunity. Now, if they'd done that, Europe would be a basket case. It would be a disaster. There would be a bitter, horrible situation. But basically, that's what the Arab states did with the Palestinians. They said, "Oh, we're not going to accept this defeat. They must go back. They have to go back." And so instead of resettling the refugees, instead of helping them find new lives and build lives in countries like Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, they kept them there permanently as refugees, as a weapon against Israel, and it's scandalous, and it has really been a deliberate attempt to delegitimize Israel and to keep the Bunsen burner, as it were, burning under Israel's feet, and it's a shocking betrayal, I think, of the Palestinians as well. Another issue to do with history is the denial of history, and particularly the denial of religious motivations of the conflict. I think one of the best examples I can give of that is Colin Chapman. He's done this a number of times, but in 2010, at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, he said, "The first occasion when any Arab government invoked the doctrine of jihad, that is against Israel, was in 1969. Now, he said this, he needed it to support his contention, his conviction, that the root objection to Israel is not religious at all, but is about dispossession. It's about the Palestinians being denied justice. It's nothing to do with religion, in his view." So he makes this claim, and actually it's an astounding claim, because the 1948 war was understood as a jihad by the Arab powers. For example, King Abdullah of Jordan in May 1948 said, "He who will be killed will be a martyr. He who lives will be glad of fighting for Palestine. I remind you of the jihad and of the martyrdom of your great-grandfathers." Now, this is just the opposite of what Colin Chapman claimed, and I believe that Colin Chapman must have only made that claim without any evidence at all. He assumed it must be so. He wanted it to be so, so he said it was so. But even in the First World War, the Turkish government authorities declared that they were fighting a jihad. I mean, it's normal for Islamic states to declare that their wars are jihads. Strictly speaking, in Islamic law, you're not allowed to fight a war unless it's a jihad. Chapman's claim was extraordinary. Al-Azhar scholars, Al-Azhar University is the supreme authority in Islamic law, and very highly regarded. In December 1947, it called for a worldwide jihad in defense of Arab Palestine, and this was to annihilate the Zionists. Also, during the 1948 war, the Palestinian Arab force was known as the Jais al-Jihad al-Muqaddas, the Holy Jihad Army. The Palestinian militia was called the Holy Jihad Army. But Colin Chapman said, oh no, no one even, called this a jihad, that struggle against Israel, until 1969. It's just complete fantasy. And it doesn't help. It's driven by an ideological desire to delegitimize Israel. That's not true. Another challenge for Israel is Islamic exceptionalism. There's this view in Islamic law, in the Sharia, that land once conquered for Islam remains Islamic forever. And actually, even when Muslims were conquering Persia, their leaders said, go and take back the land. I mean, they'd never owned it in the first place, but it was a war of liberation even so. And this is reflected in, for example, the Hamas constitution, which invokes this doctrine. So according to this view, Spain is Islamic territory as well. And I've heard it said that there are Muslims across the Mediterranean who still have the keys to their homes in Spain, wanting their right of return. So Hamas says the Islamic resistance movement believes that the land of Palestine has been an Islamic waqf, an endowment, throughout the generations until the day of resurrection. And no one can renounce it or any part of it or abandon it or part of it. No Arab country nor the aggregate of all Arab countries, and no Arab king or president, nor all of them in the aggregate, have that right, that is, to give it over to the Jews. So no two-state solution with the Jews could ever be religiously acceptable. Who can presume to speak for all Islamic generations to the day of resurrection? So what they're saying is the future generations of Muslims have this as their inheritance. You can't take it away from them. No one can. And they said this is the status of the land in Islamic Sharia, and it is similar to all lands conquered by Islam by force, and therefore made endowment lands upon their conquest for all generations of Muslims until the day of resurrection. Why do I call this Islamic exceptionalism? Well, this is the idea that land once conquered for Islam is forever Islamic, but there's no concession to anybody else. I mean, if anybody else conquers anything, that has no validity at all. It's only Islamic conquest that lasts forever. Talk about lack of reciprocity, no concept of kind of any sort of acceptance of any other power or any other political validity in the world except the political validity of Islam. And this goes hand in hand with the view that only Islam can rule. The only legitimate rule over Muslims in the Middle East has to be Islamic rule. It can't be Jewish rule, for example. Another strand in Islamic theology is victimhood. Muhammad suffered a lot. He was victimized. And what happens in the Quran is that when he turned to violence, the victimhood of Muslims is used as the justification of violence. So repeatedly, the Quran twice says that persecution of Muslims, and this is interpreted very broadly by Muslim scholars, is worse than killing. So basically to pressure Muslims to treat them in an inferior way, not to give them complete freedom to advance their faith or whatever, persecuting them, this is worse than slaughter. It justifies murder when Muslims are not on top, basically. And this victim mentality is very debilitating for the Muslim world. It causes lots of problems for Muslim countries. And you can see it breaking out. I remember one convert from Islam said, whenever there's been a massacre of Christians by Muslims, it's because there was a much bigger massacre of Muslims first. Ahmad bin Muhammad, who's an Algerian professor of religious politics, was debating the apostate from Islam, Wafa Sultan, on television in the Middle East. And he was really annoyed with her when she pointed out how Muslims had killed Muslims. The example she used was in Syria, where the government of Syria had killed a lot of Muslim Brotherhood supporters, a whole town of people. And he began to, this professor began to shout, "We are the victims! There are millions of innocent people among us, but the innocent among you number over dozens, hundreds, or thousands at the most. So I don't care how many victims you got, we got more victims than you." Another example of this victimhood thinking was when the Queen knighted Salman Rushdie, there were protests. And the Religious Affairs Minister of Pakistan said that this has hurt the feelings of 1.5 billion Muslims. So, he said, if someone explodes a bomb on his body, he would be right to do it unless the British government apologises and withdraws the Sir title from Salman Rushdie. So what this guy was saying is that if someone goes onto a British subway, an English subway in London, and blows up a crowd of people, he's completely justified unless the Queen apologizes. That slaughter is not as bad as the honor of Muslims being impugned. It's not as bad as this idea of fitna, this idea of somehow the persecution of Muslims through elevating Salman Rushdie as an author. So this is Islamic victimhood theology and ideology. It damages a lot of things, and it impacts Israel greatly. It impacts how people see Israel, especially in the West, when we're so attuned to ideologies that speak about oppression and disadvantage. There's also an ongoing crisis within Islam, and this affects the environment in which Israel is placed. There was a great crisis in Islam in the last 500 or 600 years. Basically, Islam as a system promises success to its followers. The call to prayer that rings out from the minaret says, there's no God but Allah, Muhammad is his messenger, and then it says, come to success, come to success. Islam promises success, and particularly success over non-Muslims. The Quran says that Islam is the religion of truth which will triumph all over other religions, and it also says that Muslims are the best people. They command what's right, they forbid what's wrong. So Islam promises ascendancy to Muslims. But from about 1500 onwards, the Muslim world experienced defeat on every side as the Christian, as they thought of them, Christian powers were limiting their conquests, liberating lands like Hungary, for example, and Ethiopia from Muslim rule, and on every front, from India, Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, on the frontier with Russia, across the Middle East, Napoleon invaded Egypt in the 19th century. On every front, Islam was being pushed back. And this was a challenge to the theology of dominance and success. So the response to this crisis of failure in the face of basically European technology, the response to this has been an awakening, a revival movement, which seeks to restore Muslim glory through spiritual renewal and reformation. And actually, it's not just one movement, it's a grassroots trend. And there are many, many movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Jamaat Islamiyah, many, many groups around the world have this vision or this hope that Islam will rise again. And there have been a number of countries that have adopted Islamic systems in the name of this revolution. So the Iranian revolution, Islamic revolution in 1978, was wanting to restore Islam. The Afghanistan Taliban experiment. In Algeria, there was a bloody Islamic revolution. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood promised that Islam was the solution, and finally they were voted into office. ISIS also wanted to re-establish the caliphate. Turkey wants to be the strong man of the Muslim world, showing the way to reviving Islam. It wants to kind of re-establish the glories of the Ottoman Caliphate. And you see these different Islamic groups competing for preeminence. But the problem is, every time the revolution seems to succeed in the Sharia revivalists, the extremists who want to cover women and make Christians into dhimmis and implement strict Islamic law everywhere, ban the ringing of bells and so on at churches. Whenever the Sharia compliant people get into power, it's a disaster. Societies become, like in Iran, it might have been religious once when the revolution happened, but it's basically become corrupt and very damaging. And so the solution to the crisis, which was to revive Islam and to restore it to its roots, turns out to be worse than the crisis. The solution is worse than the solution doesn't result in a utopia, but a dystopia. And you actually see these different groups competing with each other for the credibility of being the revivers of Islam, but they just produce disasters. ISIS is, one of the worst examples. So you have a destabilized Middle East now with different factions keen to claim the Islamic high ground. And one of the things that then they get motivated to do is to denounce the Jews and denounce Israel. So Iran has always had, Israel as a focus, and the reason why it does that is for the glory of Islam, in order to show its supremacy in bringing true Islam back and in overthrowing this huge insult and humiliation to the Islamic world, which is the creation of Israel within Islamic lands. So, Israel now finds itself in the midst of this crisis, this Islamic crisis. And it's a miracle that it arose in the heart of this revival, this Islamic revival. There are opportunities for Israel, however, in this crisis. I mean, the Sunnis and the Shiites are basically at each other's throats to try and dominate in the Middle East. And that means that they're so busy dealing with each other that Israel becomes the last of their worries, in fact. So the Saudis would then want Israel to help them to deal with the Iranians. And, the other thing that's happening too across the Middle East, and this will have long-term consequences, is that Muslims who've lived under Islamic systems and revived Islamic systems like ISIS or the Iranian Revolution, they begin to doubt Islam. They begin to reject it. There are lots of Saudi underground atheists, for example, who are sick of the Saudi regime's strict Islam. And there's doubt that's appearing in Islam. One of the effects of that is many Muslims are turning to Christ. There's large numbers of Muslims finding Jesus. That's a whole story in itself, but the Iranian church is perhaps one of the fastest growing national churches in the world. Hundreds of thousands have turned to Christ in Iran and also in the Iranian diaspora, and refugees from Syria and Iraq that are now in Germany are turning to Christ. Churches are full of ex-Muslims now. And so what's happened really is that the Islamic attempt to reinstitute the glories of Islam have failed again and again. So you have these failing societies with a lot of young people without economic options, and Islam is no longer the force of unity and hope that it once was, and so the Middle East is in deep trouble. Israel is going from strength to strength in the middle of that, but it's surrounded by dysfunction, and that's a real challenge for its future security. It's a challenge what's going to be happening in Lebanon. It's a challenge how Lebanon and also Jordan will deal with their huge refugee crises. It's a challenge to know where the Islamic Jihad movements will go next. So we're going to consider challenges connecting to church in the next presentation. But just in conclusion, I wanted to say that the fundamental challenge really facing Israel is Islamic. It's religious, it's ideological. It includes varieties of anti-Semitism, both Islamic and Christian, the one feeding the other now. It includes distorted historical claims that are driven by an Islamic historical sensibility. It's challenged by Islamic exceptionalism, which refuses peace. It's challenged by the Islamic tendency to victimhood, which sees every event, every conflict, every bit of history as an opportunity to proclaim the greater victimhood as Muslims. So these ideological factors have really impeded a peaceful resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians. I think they can be overcome, but it requires a great strength of vision, a clarity of purpose on Israel's part. And one of the problems is often the rest of the world ignores or underestimates the force of these issues. And as a result, people have unrealistic expectations of the kind of peace that can be produced. On the other hand, these drivers have greatly weakened the Palestinians, who've suffered a great deal and are in a position of dependence and vulnerability, really. They have no financial security themselves. They're dependent on other people's handouts. They're disliked by the rest of the Muslim world, who don't like their militancy and don't want them to import their jihad into their countries. It's a really tragic story. So these factors which have made life difficult for Israel have also weakened the Palestinians as well, and the strength of Israel is become more and more apparent as the years have passed.